Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. The city's 300,000 municipal employees have been working under expired contracts for about 4 years. Their unions have been waiting for a new mayor to negotiate new ones. Now that we have Mayor de Blasio, those negotiations are about to begin. Richard Steyer is a walking encyclopedia about New York City's unions, their histories, and current struggles. He's also the editor and featured columnist of The Chief Leader, an independent newspaper that has covered city and state governments and their unions for over 116 years. I'm happy to say that he's my guest today. How did you become so much a historian of New York City unions?
I guess it was just something that developed along the way. I started out working for the chief in 1980, and I thought that I'd spend a year or two there and then get hired by a daily newspaper, except that it didn't happen that quickly, and I discovered I enjoyed the work more than I had expected to. And eventually I left in 1989 to go to work for the New York Post, but 4 years after that there was a strike, and I wrote an op-ed column in Newsday that didn't call Rupert Murdoch any nasty names, but people might have drawn some inferences, and he apparently did, because I wasn't invited back afterwards.
So then you went back?
I went back to the chief briefly, then I went to Channel 2 for not quite 2 years, and then was fired there, and the chief beckoned again in '97, and I've been there ever since and been editor since 1998.
And so you've just accumulated all this knowledge. And
Yes.
Did you come from a union family?
My father was active in the newspaper guild at the Post and later at the New York Times. My mom was a teacher, but she was not active at all in the union. But I mean, early on there was an interest, and I couldn't tell you exactly why, except for the fact that I was interested in New York City, and unions when I was growing up in the 60s and 1970s were very much in the forefront of what was going on in the city.
And what I remember about the unions in the 60s is the anti-war movement in New York was partially led by union leaders. I mean, and Victor Gottbaum, UAW, there was Sam Myers. Then who was the man who worked for the retail workers or something? Who was the head of that union? I don't remember. Anyway, they were very vocal and around, and they were obviously leaders. Not so much today. If you asked me to name the heads of unions in New York, I could name the Board of Education and Lillian Roberts, I think, you know? What is that?
You've got fewer larger-than-life personalities at this point running unions. The one who came closest to that, both in terms of speaking up for her members and in being a target of the tabloids, was Randi Weingarten,
right,
who has since moved on to head the American Federation of Teachers, whose local union here is the United Federation of Teachers, known as the UFT. In terms of other labor leaders, I think part of it is that you don't have strikes the way that you did once upon a time, and you don't have unions necessarily getting involved in larger causes to a great degree. Ed Koch put it 15 years or so ago that unions have gone from trying to save the world to trying to save themselves because of some of the pressures that they have been feeling.
Yeah. Let's talk about why workers have been working without a contract. What happened?
Basically what happened was in 2008, Mayor Bloomberg decided in the middle of a bargaining round that the city's finances had worsened enough that he was not going to give other unions that still didn't have contracts the same 4% raises that he had given to every union that had come to the table and settled up until then. And the one that stuck out in terms of that was the UFT, partly because it's the largest city union and it's the most powerful city union. And their contract did not run out until November 1st, 2009, and there was some feeling that the union did not endorse Bill Thompson, who was running against him, partly because it was hoping that a deal could be reached with Bloomberg, and he may have decided to dangle them on that notion rather than simply say that the sluice gates are shut. Yeah. And he simply plowed ahead, saying that he couldn't afford to give anybody any more raises and that he would reward teachers by not laying them off, that they should be happy with that. And naturally, they weren't happy about it. So you had teachers without a contract, you had principals without a contract, you have school custodians without a contract, and you have nurses, both registered nurses and licensed practical nurses, who haven't gotten a contract. And you have this long history in the city of pattern bargaining, which means that the first union that makes a significant settlement, that serves as the pattern for the remainder of the bargaining round. And so to tell people, well, I gave some people this, but you can't get it because no. And they know that they can go into arbitration and more than likely win the exact settlement. In terms of the rest of the city workforce, which was under contract and had deals for the period that the UFT was looking for, they would have liked to have gotten something, but the mayor at this point told them that we're not going to give you anything unless you pay for it with savings. And at a certain point, unions realized that he was serious about this and just decided, let's wait him out. More than likely, a Democrat's going to be elected mayor. A Democrat is going to understand that you can't simply go ahead and do that. And so if we've got to wait, we'll wait.
And they've been without it, so now they want retroactive pay. But we'll get to that in a minute. There are certain things I want to know. We know of the big unions in the city. What are they? The UFT, DC 37, tell me.
The Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, Uniform Firefighters Association, Teamsters Local 237 would, among them, be the 5 primaries.
But that's not who negotiates contracts. It's like 140 or how many people?
There are, I think it's 153 unions altogether with unsettled contracts.
So take DC 37, that has a lot of unions in it.
It has 55 locals.
So does Lillian Roberts go to the negotiation? Or does each local go?
It would be something where DC 37 puts together a bargaining committee. The heads of some of the larger locals would usually be part of the bargaining committee. But ultimately, in terms of negotiations, Lillian might be present, but usually you designate someone who's your head of negotiations and research who is doing the hard bargaining for the city. You might be at the table with them, but you might be called in only when it looks like you're close to a deal, that the nuts and bolts get taken care of by what are sometimes known as technicians.
So the unions, but they cluster. In the police, so you've got the PBA, then you've got the sergeants, you've got, I don't know who else. What else do you have?
You have lieutenants, you have detectives, you have captains.
You have the traffic guys, are they?
The traffic guys are part of 2 different locals, one belonging to DC 37, one belonging to the Communications Workers of America.
So they get together and they sort of develop a strategy for all of them?
They will have conversations. They don't necessarily stick with that strategy.
Right.
You've had situations where unions have agreed to go together in coalition, and then one of them would suddenly break off and announce that it had negotiated a contract. You've had that happen most recently with the firefighters union. There was a point 27 or 28 years ago where DC 37, along with Teamsters Local 237 and the UFT, all went in together, but then the UFT did not stay with them. They negotiated contracts on their own, and the UFT wound up going to arbitration.
So how many unions do we have of municipal employees? Do you know?
I mean, they talk in terms of 153 contracts. That sounds high. I mean, my guess is that there are 60 or 70 unions. Then you'll have locals within some of the unions that, you know, adds on to it. And some of them represent just 100 or 200 members, that they're not large at all, and they would simply wait to see what the overall settlement is and then look to get the same thing.
And then EMS is part of the fire department?
EMS is part of the fire department, but the EMS locals are part of DC 37.
That's very good. So it makes a lot of sense, right? No.
Well, you have to realize that there was a point where EMS was part of the Health and Hospitals Corporation, and DC 37 represented most of the people there, and so it was a logical place for them to fit under the bargaining umbrella.
Is 1199 Hospital Corporation?
1199, actually, most of its members are working in private sector. They're in a League of Voluntary Hospitals, or they're working in private nursing homes. They've got about 4,000 city members who consist, used to be primarily pharmacists and dietitians. More recently, they've added some licensed practical nurses. But it's a relatively small segment of a very large and powerful union. But it does not get greatly involved in the city bargaining talks because of that.
Can we just briefly describe what collective bargaining is?
Sure. Collective bargaining is the process by which a union comes in and negotiates with the city on a contract. That It used to be the unions would describe what occurred as collective begging, that they would go in, they would ask for a raise for their members, they would hold demonstrations, there would be the occasional publicized situation. There was a case where parks workers had a rally in which one parks worker was placed in a tiger cage because the parks workers deal with the zoos, and this was supposed to indicate how they felt in terms of their treatment by the parks commissioner at the time, who was Robert Moses. You used to have strikes with some frequency. They became much less so after the Taylor Law was passed.
Which prohibited, or heavy fines, what is it?
Heavy fines is the main problem, heavy fines and the loss of dues checkoff, because the dues checkoff is something that the unions were granted under the collective bargaining law. They have, union members don't pay directly to delegates or shop stewards who go around to collect. It's taken out of their paychecks when they are paid by the city. One of the powers that the city has, or any municipality or state entity has under the Taylor Law, is to ask a judge to take away dues checkoff rights, which means they have to go out and collect it by hand the way that they did in the old days. And in 1980, you had an 11-day strike by transit workers, and they were fined $900,000 by a judge, which sounds like a pretty severe hit on a union's budget. That wasn't the big problem for them. The big problem was that they lost the dues checkoff right, and a lot of members who weren't happy about what happened during the strike weren't that anxious to pay, in part because the penalty that's imposed on individual workers is the loss of 2 days' pay for every day on strike, which meant that they were losing the equivalent of 22 days' salary, so that financially it was a strain to have to pay union dues, and if you were not feeling good, then that gave you even more reason not to pay.
So now we go back to collective bargaining. So the union comes in and the city comes in, and they have to come to an agreement?
They don't have to come to an agreement. It's something that ideally they want to. Once upon a time, you had a policy among unions of no contract, no work, which meant that if a contract expired and a new one wasn't in place, that they were going to go out on strike. One of the things that the Taylor Law provided for was the right to binding arbitration. And binding arbitration was supposed to be a solution because of the fact that you would have a third party coming in and, in essence, working out a settlement, either splitting the difference between the two sides' positions or deciding that one side had a better case than the other and imposing a settlement that the second side wasn't going to be that thrilled about. But this, along with what became a tradition of providing for retroactivity and raises, meant that the unions no longer had an incentive to go out on strike and had pretty big disincentives to walk off the job, simply because you knew that even if it was delayed, if it took a year or 2 years beyond the expiration of the contract, once a deal was reached, that members were going to be getting money, were getting back pay, going back to the time that the old contract expired.
So did the Taylor Law and collective bargaining come together?
Yes.
Well, actually, the unions support that?
Actually, I shouldn't say that, because collective bargaining rights were actually granted in New York City in 1958. Things didn't get completely formalized until 1966, when you had the Office of Municipal Labor Relations created, as well as the Office of Collective Bargaining. The Office of Collective Bargaining, contrary to what it sounds like, is actually the mediation and arbitration office. The reason for that is that some secretary got the two charters wrong, and so that she typed Office of Collective Bargaining for what should have been the Office of Municipal Labor Relations, and vice versa, and they just never bothered to change it. Yes.
God, so when people say they don't understand what's going on, there's sometimes very good reason.
There's
because nobody understands what's going on, right?
There's some fairly arcane stuff in there, yes.
Yeah. But the interesting thing about the collective bargaining is that it followed the state of Wisconsin, right?
The
state of Wisconsin
actually got a collective bargaining law passed a year after New York City adopted it. New York State did not adopt collective bargaining law until Wisconsin was the first state in the country.
And now they've undone it.
Yes.
So we hope it won't happen here. Yeah. So all of these unions are going to start to negotiate with the Office of
Labor
Relations, right. And they want, because most of them haven't had contracts for 4 years, but some of them have.
Most of them have been more than 3 years without a contract. There are exceptions. The Sergeants Union back in 2007 agreed to a 74-month contract that didn't run out until, I believe it's the summer of 2011. But the largest police union, the PBA, its contract ran out August 1st of 2010. Same thing for the firefighters union. So you're generally talking close to 3.5 years for them. For the UFT, you're talking more than 4 years at this point, pretty much 50 months under an expired
So the important question on the table during these negotiations is going to be the question of retroactive pay, health benefits, and increase in salary, right?
Yes. But there's also a division there. You'll have the situation with unions like the UFT, which are in arbitration for a period before the period in which the police and the firefighters and most of the other unions are looking to negotiate. And so that in terms of that arbitration, it's a question as to whether the other talks can go forward until that's straightened out, until it's known whether you're
How
going
long
to
does it take, the process of arbitration?
Arbitration, the UFT arbitration is pretty much done. An arbitration for nurses represented by the New York State Nurses Association is wrapping up later this month. And then it becomes a question of how soon the panels turn around and issue awards. It should
And they're
be
two separate entities, though.
two separate arbitrations. And what's important about the nurses arbitration, which is for a much smaller group of employees, the UFT process is non-binding. It's recommendations. Very often they serve as the framework for an eventual settlement, but it's not something that the city or the union is locked into. In the case of the nurses, it is binding. So once it comes down, it's pretty much final. The city could always have the option of appealing it to court, but courts generally give very short shrift to appeals of administrative rulings.
So these nurses are nurses from where?
They are
Schools?
nurses who work in, they work in the Health and Hospitals Corporation. School nurses are actually represented by different unions. There is, I think DC 37 represents some of them. I think the UFT has a contingent as well. But most of the nurses who work with, in the city hospital system are represented by the New York State Nurses Association, or to a lesser and more recent degree, 1199.
Is there a chart, like a family tree? Could we ever have that?
You would probably
Wouldn't
be
that be
best asking
interesting?
the Office of Labor Relations if it had something
That
like
would be interesting. So if you were to raise, they have figures for each point that is raised in a salary, it costs the city what? What, do you know what is
At this point,
it?
I think on a citywide basis, it probably comes to, several $100 million, but I can't give you a
Do you have a guess as to what's going to happen with these contracts?
I do.
Yes,
I
let's
think,
have it.
I think that the arbitrators are going to give the UFT and the nurses the same 4% raises that other people got based on the long history of pattern bargaining, which is a history that has been not only adhered to by mayors in the past, but has been championed by them when unions like the UFT and the PBA would look to make a case for greater raises because of higher salaries being paid in the suburbs in Long Island and Westchester. And these mayors would talk about the importance of preserving a bargaining pattern. And Bloomberg did that as well. And this is something where one of the things arbitrators don't tend to be impressed by is a mayor coming in and saying, well, that was then, but this is now.
So what happens to the UFT salaries? I mean, so they say, all right, 4% increase. On what? Does that go back retroactive then?
Unless there was a drastic change, and I've talked to people in the business who say they'd be very surprised if the arbitrators decided to go against that, then there's a great chance that you will have that money being retroactive to November 1st of 2009, which is when the first year's increase would take effect, and the second raise would be effective November 1st, 2010. And you're talking a whole lot of money.
Because is that going to kick into the pattern bargaining?
It would not. It would simply conform to the pattern that had
With the other
already been
unions,
set
I
by
mean.
the mayor with
Yeah.
most other unions.
Yeah.
The other unions, what they're looking for is something that picks up from where that UFT arbitration will leave off. I mean, one of the interesting questions that's come into play, you have a new administration, and it may want to get things done and know what its costs are. rather than waiting for those to come down, because then you begin anew the process of bargaining with everybody for this new round, which by now is an old round. And so the question becomes, Bob Lynn is a former chief negotiator under Ed Koch, and he is now de Blasio's chief negotiator. I asked last week whether he would look to talk to the UFT and the nurses to see whether they could settle things quickly rather than waiting. And he basically demurred, said that wasn't going to talk about any approaches right now, but there is that possibility.
Yeah. It's, you know, what's implicit in all of this, though, is the public opinion has really not, it's not supportive of, I don't think, of the union members, is it?
It all depends.
It's been so presented to us as the reason that we're in fiscal crisis, which is so insane because, you know, everybody talks about the middle class. We've got to help the middle class. And the union workers are the middle class, and yet they fire them or lay them off or do punitive things like not giving them raises. I mean, isn't that contrary to?
Well, the perception is that unlike most workers in private industry, these are people who they're getting raises out of the pocket of the taxpayer. And some people would say, well, I haven't gotten a raise at my job in years, so that why should these people be getting raises? And you had the mayor basically with a well-orchestrated campaign against the unions. I mean, he was going back looking to take away pension benefits from cops and firefighters, as well as pension-related benefits, going back to 2009. There's been probably a backlash among some people who don't think that much of Bloomberg and who thought that he increasingly favored the rich in his policies during his last 4 years in office, and thus a greater sympathy towards city employees. But it has always been tough, and you will always see editorial letters pages in the tabloids complaining about why should these people be getting any additional money, that they're lucky they have jobs.
Right. Let's talk about unions. They all operate differently, right? Even the unions under the umbrella.
Yes.
So you have a book out that it's very interesting, and I've read it, and I hope people will look at it also. You give histories of some of the things. DC 37 has a long history. And when they vote, I mean, they're as corrupt as politicians or as mediocre. I mean, they're running parallel to our elected officials these days.
They can be. It's something where when I was first working for the chief in the 80s and friends of mine would ask me about corruption within the unions, I would say, no, it's nothing like what you would see in the private sector Teamsters or in terms of the Longshoremen's Union or some of the other unions that were known to have mob connections or simply were bad actors. That the unions seem to be remarkably clean compared to private sector counterparts. But then in the 90s, you'd start to see some of this corruption bubbling to the surface, that you had the Transit Police Union, which was basically giving business to lawyers and then taking kickbacks from those lawyers in return for that business. You had a massive corruption scandal in DC 37 in which they managed to rig a contract vote under an agreement with the city that froze pay for the first 2 years of the contract. And you also had massive stealing going on, and there was some speculation that the reason that some of the union officials who were stealing were also involved in the attempt to fix the contract was because they thought that Giuliani might suspect that something was amiss, and that if the contract had gone down and messed up his plan to get his budget in line by having a 2-year wage freeze, that he would start drawing attention to some of the stuff that they had been doing.
What I was amused about, they got kickbacks from buying the turkeys that they gave to the union members for Christmas or something. But anyway, people always steal too little, it seems to me, and except some of the big ones. What are we going to do in this country, though, and generally in the city, to really bring some democratic principles to some of the unions that don't have really democratic elections? Well, there's no body to do that, is there? It's all within the union.
International unions have that possibility. When DC 37 had the scandal, its national union, AFSCME, came in and cleaned up the union's financial house. But they did not change the system under which you don't have union members voting for their leadership. Lillian Roberts is elected not by the 100,000 plus members that she represents, but by about 300 delegates who very often are being given stipends and committee positions that allow them to go on trips and collect extra money, and that's all that they care about. They're not worried about whether she's really serving the members well. And this was the thing that created the problem back during the 90s, and the reason that the International did not make the change is because it's easier to control things when you just have, you're not worried that you're going to have some renegade come in who's going to give you a hard time down in Washington as well as in New York City.
So it's all self-interest, about, or not all, we should generalize. I mean, there's some very good people doing very good things.
There are some very good people running unions. There are also situations where you have enough union involvement on the part of the rank and file to keep the leaders honest. One of the problems with DC 37, many of its members are not particularly well paid, and in situations where they're single parents, they're just not going to have the time, they're not going to have the ability to arrange daycare for them to take an active role in the union, and so that they're pretty much passive observers of what's going on.
And then they have things like having to come to the headquarters to vote rather than being able to mail in a ballot.
Yes. Yeah,
that story in your book is fascinating. So it has to come from within the union.
Yes. Or if somebody in the Central Labor Council, which is the umbrella group for the city, or the AFL-CIO tells people we've got to clean things up because we have real problems, there are forces that are out to hurt us, and not having a good image is not helping at all.
But the Central Labor Council has had its share also.
Well, Brian McLaughlin was one of the biggest thieves in municipal history.
That was unbelievable.
Yes.
That was really unbelievable.
And he was someone who was actually capable. He was the best
Right.
leader that they had in 15 or 20 years.
Right.
And then he
People
turned out
talked
to be
about
a
him
crook.
as a mayoral candidate.
Yes.
And look what happened.
Yeah.
Silly, stupid things.
Greedy things.
Greedy. So once again, we come to the question of greed and of rich people, of high incomes, and other people struggling to make a living and make a decent life for themselves. Well, we got so much to talk about. We'll have to come back when we are in these negotiations.
I'd be happy to.
And thank you for all the lessons and explanations.
Thanks,
Richard Steyer. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.